The world of the USS Franklin on March 19, 1945, was a microcosm of hell, unleashed 50 miles from the Japanese mainland. The massive aircraft carrier, a symbol of American naval might, was being systematically torn apart from within. Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Allaghan, his face smudged with soot and sweat, felt the deck plates heave beneath his feet for the 23rd time in an hour. Each new explosion was a fresh convulsion, a reminder that the ship was enduring a prolonged and violent death agony. The air was unbreathable, a thick, choking miasma of acrid black smoke that poured from every shattered hatch, doorway, and gaping wound in the flight deck. It was a smoke born of burning aviation gasoline, seared paint, melting rubber, and incinerated human flesh. Through the shifting, poisonous veil, O'Allaghan watched a team of sailors, their faces set in masks of grim determination, manhandle a fire hose. What they directed into the roaring inferno consuming the hangar deck was not a massive, high-pressure stream of water, but a fine, misting spray from a fog nozzle. To an uninformed observer, it would have looked pathetically inadequate, like using a garden sprinkler to confront a volcanic eruption. Yet this delicate mist was, in fact, the most advanced naval firefighting technology of its day, a last thin barrier standing between over 700 men and a watery grave or immolation. The scene was a testament to a revolution born of catastrophe and forced upon a reluctant institution. The story of how this New York firefighter's tool became the salvation of the fleet is a profound lesson in institutional inertia, the price of flawed doctrine, and the power of empirical truth over entrenched tradition. This transformation did not begin in the heat of battle off Japan, but in the peacetime complacency of a navy whose strategic thinking had dangerously outpaced its tactical capabilities. For generations, the United States Navy had built ever more complex and powerful warships, yet its fundamental approach to containing the ancient enemy of fire had remained stagnant, rooted in the age of sail. The doctrine was simple: overwhelming force in the form of solid, high-volume streams of water. This methodology was adequate for the types of fires expected on wooden vessels, burning canvas, rope, or isolated mess deck blazes. It was entirely unsuited for the new reality of steel behemoths packed with thousands of tons of high-explosive ordnance and hundreds of thousands of gallons of highly volatile aviation fuel. The man who would become the reluctant architect of this naval revolution was Lieutenant Harold J. Burke, a Navy reservist whose true expertise had been forged not on the rolling decks of warships, but in the cramped fire-trap tenements and sprawling combustible waterfront warehouses of New York City. Burke's journey from FDNY deputy chief to naval reformer was set in motion by a single, catastrophic event that exposed the fatal gaps in the Navy's preparedness. That event was the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, a day that revealed not just a failure of intelligence and readiness, but a fundamental flaw in the Navy's very ability to preserve its own capital ships from destruction after the initial damage was done. The losses at Pearl Harbor were a masterclass in the cascading failures of inadequate damage control. The USS Arizona provided the most horrifying example, her forward magazine detonating with cataclysmic force, breaking the ship's back and consigning over 1,000 men to death in minutes. But other tragedies unfolded more slowly, offering agonizing glimpses of what might have been saved. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors in an inverted steel tomb where the sounds of their desperate pounding on the hull would haunt rescuers for days. The USS West Virginia and USS California settled into the harbor mud, not solely from torpedo damage, but from fires that burned uncontrollably for 30 hours or more, fed by spilled fuel oil that fire crews had no effective means to extinguish. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. Bombs and torpedoes had provided the initial spark, but it was the unchecked spread of fire that turned battle damage into total loss. The Navy's damage control parties, brave and disciplined as they were, fought with tools and techniques that were not just ineffective, but often counterproductive. Solid streams of water directed at burning oil simply scattered the flaming liquid, spreading the conflagration into new compartments. The immense heat generated by fuel fires created superheated gases that flashover could ignite instantaneously, killing entire fire teams. Sailors found themselves unable to even approach within 50 feet of blazes due to radiant heat, their high-volume hoses useless as the water turned to steam before reaching the seat of the fire. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. Men trained to believe in their equipment were left with a profound sense of helplessness as they watched their ships be consumed by an enemy they had no way to fight. It was in the aftermath of this disaster that Lieutenant Burke, studying the official damage reports and survivor testimonies, found grim validation for all his previous, ignored warnings. The photographs of scorched and sunken ships, the accounts of futile firefighting efforts, they all pointed to a single, urgent conclusion. The United States Navy, for all its technological sophistication, needed to learn a lesson that municipal fire departments had already mastered: that when fighting fire, especially fires fed by volatile liquids, science and finesse could triumph where brute force and volume would inevitably fail. The journey to save future USS Franklins had begun, but it would be an arduous climb against a mountain of tradition, skepticism, and institutional pride. The civilian expert and the wall of naval tradition Harold J. Burke was an unlikely agent of change for a service as steeped in tradition as the United States Navy. His authority was not derived from Annapolis or from command at sea, but from 2 decades of brutal, practical experience in the firehouses of New York City. He had joined the FDNY during a period of rapid urban expansion and technological transition, learning his craft in an environment where fire was a daily and democratic threat. He had battled infernos in 5-story walk-up tenements, where wooden interior construction and a lack of fire escapes turned buildings into death traps. He had fought sprawling, dangerous blazes in dockside warehouses filled with paint, turpentine, and other industrial chemicals, where conventional firefighting methods could prove disastrous. Through this grueling apprenticeship, Burke developed a sophisticated understanding of fire behavior. He learned that fire was not a monolithic enemy, but a phenomenon that behaved differently depending on its fuel, environment, and available oxygen. He witnessed the critical transition in firefighting technology from sheer water volume to targeted application. Most importantly, he saw the advent and refinement of the fog nozzle, a tool that could break a stream of water into a cloud of microscopic droplets. This mist, which seemed so insubstantial, possessed revolutionary properties. It created a massive cumulative surface area, allowing for incredibly efficient heat absorption. It could be used to generate steam, which would expand and smother flames by displacing oxygen. It could create protective curtains of water to cool superheated gases and shield advancing firefighters. This was the knowledge Burke carried with him when he reported for active duty. Assigned to inspect damage control procedures aboard ships in port, Burke was met with a culture shock that bordered on professional horror. He found a firefighting doctrine that was centuries out of date. The primary tool was the straight-bore nozzle, designed to deliver a solid, powerful stream of water. The training emphasized the aggressive interior attack, getting as close to the fire as possible and overwhelming it with gallons per minute. To Burke, this was not just antiquated. It was a recipe for catastrophe when applied to the unique environment of a modern warship. He tried to explain the physics. A solid stream, he would argue, had limited surface area. Most of the water would pass through the flames without absorbing significant heat, ultimately draining away as wasteful runoff. When used on burning liquids, the force of the stream would splatter the fuel, dramatically spreading the fire. In contrast, a fog pattern would blanket the fire, absorbing heat rapidly, generating steam, and extinguishing the flames without scattering them. He was met with blank stares, polite skepticism, or outright hostility. The Navy had been fighting fires this way since the days of John Paul Jones. Who was this civilian, this flatfoot from New York, to tell them their traditions were wrong? Burke became a bureaucratic Cassandra, submitting report after report that documented these critical deficiencies and recommending the immediate adoption of fog nozzles and a complete overhaul of training. His memos were acknowledged, filed away, and largely ignored. The institutional resistance was multifaceted. There was a deep-seated cultural belief that naval warfare was a unique profession whose mysteries could not be understood by outsiders. There was a psychological aversion to equipment that looked feeble compared to the powerful jet of a solid stream. There was the bureaucratic inertia of an organization reluctant to admit a potentially fatal flaw in its doctrine, especially so soon after the shock of Pearl Harbor, and underpinning it all was the simple human resistance to change, particularly when proposed by someone from outside the tribe. This resistance persisted even as the war provided tragic, ongoing evidence supporting Burke's claims. The loss of the aircraft carrier USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea was a prime example. The ship had survived initial battle damage, but then fuel vapors accumulated and ignited, triggering a series of explosions and fires. Damage control parties fought valiantly with solid streams, but they were unable to prevent the fires from spreading, fed by leaking aviation gasoline. The ship was eventually lost. The same story played out with the USS Wasp, torpedoed in the Solomons. Solid streams scattered the burning gasoline across her hangar deck, accelerating the blaze and leading to her sinking. In the face of these losses, the Navy's bureaucracy remained a formidable fortress, and Burke's carefully reasoned arguments were like waves breaking against its walls. He needed a breakthrough, a powerful ally within the naval establishment who could see past tradition and recognize empirical truth, the demonstration and the dawning of a new era. The turning point in Lieutenant Burke's crusade arrived with the appointment of Rear Admiral Edward L. Cochrane as Chief of the Bureau of Ships in November 1942. Cochrane was an engineer, a man whose career had been dedicated to the technical realities of ship construction and systems. Unlike many of his peers, his thinking was rooted in the principles of physics and mechanics, not just operational tradition. The alarming rate at which damaged ships were being lost to fire had drawn his direct attention, creating a crucial opening for Burke's ideas. Burke secured a meeting with the admiral, a pivotal encounter that would determine the fate of his proposal. He came prepared with his arguments, but Cochrane, the engineer, was not interested in anecdotes or appeals to municipal experience. He interrogated Burke with sharp, technical questions about thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and heat transfer rates. He wanted to understand the precise mechanics of how a fog pattern could be more effective than a solid stream. Burke, drawing on both his FDNY experience and his understanding of the underlying science, provided detailed answers. He explained the exponential increase in surface area, the efficiency of steam conversion, and the tactical applications for different fire scenarios. Admiral Cochrane was intellectually intrigued, but remained visually skeptical. The concept of a fine mist outperforming a powerful water jet was counterintuitive. "Lieutenant," he reportedly said, "the Navy doesn't change equipment and doctrine based on theories and municipal experience. If you want me to consider this seriously, you need to demonstrate that fog nozzles actually work better than solid streams under controlled conditions where we can measure results." Burke immediately accepted the challenge. He was given 1 week to prepare what would become the most critical demonstration of his career. He commandeered a facility at a naval yard and constructed a realistic steel compartment mock-up designed to replicate the confined spaces and limited ventilation of a shipboard interior. He procured the same 100-octane aviation gasoline that powered carrier aircraft. Most importantly, he installed a battery of instruments, thermocouples, flow meters, and timers to provide irrefutable quantitative data. This would not be about impressions. It would be about cold, hard numbers. On the day of the demonstration, Admiral Cochrane arrived, accompanied by a cadre of senior officers from the Bureau of Ships and the Training Command. The audience was a mix of the genuinely curious and the openly skeptical, the latter group expecting to see this civilian reservist's fanciful ideas thoroughly debunked. The first test, using the standard Navy 2.5-inch solid stream nozzle, was a disaster that perfectly confirmed Burke's warnings. The high-pressure stream hit the pool of burning gasoline and spectacularly scattered it, spreading the fire across a wider area. The flames danced and flared where the fuel was splashed. The crew fought valiantly, but after 5 minutes and 7 seconds and 420 gallons of water, the fire was finally out. The compartment was flooded, and the residual temperatures remained lethally high, over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Then came the fog nozzle. The crew advanced, not aiming directly at the flames, but deploying a wide-angle fog pattern that settled like a blanket over the fire zone. The effect was dramatic and immediate. The visible flames shrank back, suffocated by the steam and cooled by the microscopic water droplets. In 1 minute and 32 seconds, using a mere 75 gallons of water, the fire was completely extinguished. The fog stream was then swept across the overhead and bulkheads, cooling the entire space to a temperature safe for entry. The data was undeniable, 3 times faster, with 1/5 of the water, and a far safer result. The final side-by-side demonstration removed any lingering doubt. The fog team achieved knockdown in under a minute, while the solid stream team was still battling scattered, persistent pockets of fire several minutes later. Admiral Cochrane had seen enough. He turned to Burke and gave him the authorization he had sought for so long. The bureaucratic dam had broken. The United States Navy would adopt fog nozzles, and Burke was tasked with the monumental job of creating a fleet-wide training program to teach an entire generation of sailors how to fight fire all over again. Forging a fireproof fleet, training, production, and baptism by fire with Admiral Cochrane's mandate in hand, Lieutenant Burke faced a task of staggering scale and urgency to re-equip and retrain the entire United States Navy in the midst of a global war. Traditional military timelines for such a transformation were measured in years. Burke had, at best, a few months before the fleet's new capabilities would be tested in the crucible of combat. He immediately recruited Lieutenant Kilduff, a fellow reservist from the Boston Fire Department, and together they formed the nucleus of what would become a revolutionary training command. Their philosophy was radical for its time. Confidence is born of competence, and competence is forged in realistic experience. Rejecting the standard model of classroom-heavy instruction, Burke and Kilduff designed a program that was almost entirely hands-on. At the first training facility established at the Boston Naval Yard, they built elaborate, full-scale fire props from salvaged ship parts, mock-ups of engine rooms, berthing compartments, and most critically, a hangar deck capable of simulating an aviation gasoline fire. These were not sterile training aids. They were designed to replicate the heat, smoke, chaos, and psychological pressure of a real shipboard fire within the bounds of safety. The curriculum was intensive and progressive. Day 1 combined a brief classroom session on the physics of fog firefighting with immediate, practical application in live fire scenarios. Sailors, suited in heavy protective gear, learned to advance hoses through zero visibility conditions, to use fog patterns to cool superheated gases and prevent flashover, and to work as coordinated teams. The training was physically brutal and mentally taxing, pushing men to their limits to build what Burke called muscle memory for firefighting. They repeated evolutions until their movements became automatic, until the fear was replaced by focused procedure. Burke and Kilduff personally oversaw the training of the first 260 instructors, a hand-picked cadre drawn largely from municipal fire departments who understood both the techniques and the pedagogy required to teach them. These instructors then fanned out to establish identical schools at every major naval base across the country and in forward areas like Pearl Harbor. The standardization was critical. A sailor trained in San Diego would use the exact same techniques and equipment as one trained in Norfolk, ensuring seamless coordination in multi-ship actions. Simultaneously, the Bureau of Ships launched a massive logistical effort to equip the fleet. Contracts were rushed to manufacturers like the Rockwood Sprinkler Company, whose factories shifted to round-the-clock production of the standardized all-purpose fog nozzles. The supply chain, already strained by global war, had to find room for thousands of these new units, prioritizing their delivery to combat vessels in forward theaters. It was a testament to the Navy's logistical prowess that by mid-1944, fog nozzles were becoming standard equipment on virtually every frontline warship in the Pacific. The new doctrine was soon tested, and it proved its worth repeatedly. The light cruiser Birmingham survived a torpedo hit by using fog nozzles to attack fires indirectly through ventilation ducts. The destroyer Spence withstood bomb hits, her crews using fog to contain fires without compromising stability through excessive water weight. The destroyer Laffey endured an almost unimaginable ordeal off Okinawa, hit by 4 bombs and 6 kamikaze aircraft in 80 minutes. Her damage control parties, using fog nozzles under relentless attack, fought multiple simultaneous fires, extinguishing burning gasoline without spreading it and preventing catastrophic flooding. The ship, a shattered wreck, survived, a floating testament to the new doctrine's effectiveness. These successes, and dozens of others, validated Burke's life's work. The psychological transformation within the fleet was as important as the technical one. Sailors were no longer fatalistic in the face of fire. They had been given the tools and the training to fight back effectively, and their confidence translated into saved ships and lives. They were no longer simply victims of catastrophe. They were active participants in their own survival. This newfound resilience would soon be put to its ultimate test aboard the vessel that had come to symbolize the Navy's firefighting crisis. The USS Franklin, the ultimate test and an enduring legacy. The USS Franklin was already a veteran of the new kind of naval warfare when she found herself off the coast of Japan on March 19, 1945. She had been severely damaged 5 months earlier by a kamikaze hit, and on that occasion, her crew, trained in Burke's methods, had saved her. That hard-won experience would prove invaluable, for the damage she was about to sustain was of an entirely different magnitude, damage that should have consigned her to the bottom of the Pacific. The 2 Japanese bombs that struck the Franklin that morning could not have hit in a more devastating location. They detonated amidst aircraft on the flight and hangar decks that were fully fueled and armed for a strike. The result was an instantaneous cataclysm. Over 15,000 gallons of aviation gasoline ignited in a fireball that consumed the hangar. Bombs, tiny Tim rockets, and millions of rounds of ammunition began cooking off, turning the ship's interior into a shooting gallery of high-explosive projectiles and shrapnel. Power failed. Fire mains ruptured. Communications were destroyed. In the first 10 minutes, hundreds of men were killed. The ship was dead in the water, listing and adrift just 50 miles from enemy territory, consumed by an inferno that raged across multiple decks. What followed was an epic of damage control that stands unparalleled in naval history. Led by figures like Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan and Lieutenant Donald Gary, surviving crew members waged an 8-hour battle against the firestorm. They fought with every tool at their disposal, but the fog nozzles were their primary weapon. With the ship's pressure systems failed, the fog nozzle's ability to operate effectively at low water pressure was critical. Solid streams would have been useless, but the fog patterns could still convert the limited water available into a life-saving mist. The crews used these nozzles with brilliant tactical acumen. When direct assault was impossible, they used extension applicators to poke nozzles through doorways and vents, cooling spaces from a distance. They directed fog into the forward magazines, preventing a catastrophic detonation that would have vaporized the ship. Lieutenant Gary led rescue parties through passageways where temperatures exceeded 500 degrees, using fog streams to create protective water curtains that allowed them to reach and save 252 trapped men. The light cruiser Santa Fe bravely came alongside to provide additional nozzles, pumps, and to evacuate wounded, a daring maneuver that exemplified the fleet-wide commitment to saving the carrier. The fight was a brutal war of attrition against fire, explosion, and exhaustion. But gradually, the scientific principles that Burke had championed began to turn the tide. The fog absorbed heat, generated steam that smothered flames, and cooled structural steel. It did all this with minimal water, preventing the catastrophic flooding that could have capsized the heavily listing ship. After 8 hours, the fires were beaten. The USS Franklin, a charred and mangled hulk, had survived. She would steam under her own power for 12,000 miles back to New York, the most heavily damaged ship ever to survive its wounds. The survival of the Franklin was the ultimate validation of Harold Burke's transformation. The official analysis was unequivocal. Without fog nozzles and the training to use them, the ship would have been lost. The impact of this revolution extended far beyond a single ship. It altered the strategic calculus of the Pacific War, giving commanders confidence that ships could survive massive damage and return to fight another day. The cumulative economic savings from preserved ships ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Most importantly, tens of thousands of sailors lived who would otherwise have perished. Burke's legacy did not end with the war. The fog nozzle became a standard tool in municipal and industrial firefighting worldwide, its adoption accelerated by returning veterans. The principles he championed, the science of heat absorption, the value of realistic training, the need for standardized doctrine, became embedded in fire service culture globally. Harold J. Burke himself faded from public view, his later life poorly documented. He served briefly as chief of the New York City Fire Department in 1947 before retiring into obscurity. He never sought fame, but his monument was not in statues or headlines. It was in every ship that lived to see peace, in every sailor who came home, and in the enduring knowledge that he had the courage to challenge a mighty institution, and in doing so had made it stronger, smarter, and infinitely more resilient. His story is a timeless lesson in the power of ideas, the importance of perseverance, and the profound impact that one determined individual, armed with truth and experience, can have on the course of history.